We know that NPP is the difference between GPP and respiration, but what is left over after respiration? So net primary production is the net carbon gain by plants. And the equation that we use for NPP again is GPP minus the respiration by plants. When we measure NPP, it's generally measured on annual timescales. So there's different periods that you can measure NPP. Sometimes it's weekly, monthly, but generally not longer than annual timescales. And it's an empirical metric. It's when we think about NPP, we're oftenly measuring it out in the field. So it's a theoretical construct, but the numbers that we get are empirical. And being an empirical metric, there are biases in the estimates that we have of NPP. For example, often we can underestimate NPP due to turnover. So if we're looking at a grassland and we say in the beginning of spring there's very little grass, and then by the end of the year there's a lot of grass, we can clip off the grass and weigh it, and that might be our estimate of NPP, at least above ground. But during this whole time, there are leaves that are being produced and are dying or are getting eaten that is part of NPP, but we're going to miss it because it's hard to measure. So there's a whole number of reasons that biomass is going to turn over within the period that we're measuring NPP. That makes it hard to get really good estimates of NPP. So table 6.2 walks you through the major components of NPP and what percentage of NPP we think each of them is on average. So new plant biomass is considered to be 40 to 70%, and that tends to be broken down into leaves, stems, and then roots. Now, among these metrics, roots is probably the most uncertain, even though it says 30 to 40% here, because it's really hard to measure. But 40 to 70% of all the biomass, 40-70% of NPP is new plant biomass. And then there's all these other components that can be pretty hard to measure. Root secretions, plants will exude compounds into the rhizosphere, and they also transfer sugars to mycorrhizal fungi, and that can be a substantial component of the carbon budget of plants. But if you're just thinking about plant biomass, we're going to miss it. Now we think of mycorrhizal fungi as a subcontract to fungi from plants and don't necessarily include it in the plant component, but it can be pretty sizable. And then losses to herbivores and mortality, that turnover I was talking about, can be up to 40% of NPP, and sometimes we're going to miss a large chunk of it. Lastly, there's volatile emissions, so there's compounds that are emitted from leaves into the atmosphere, and those are super hard to measure, but we tend to think of them as being 0 to 5%. Among all of those numbers, it's probably important to know that we don't do below ground NPP that well. It's hard to get estimates of how many roots are being produced and how long they live. So of all those numbers that are up there, probably the most uncertain one is what's happening below ground.